The police are necessary to the healthy functioning of society, offering a thin blue line between us and barbarism. If we care about crime and want to live in a peaceful, prosperous place, we should consent to them having all the resources they want. And each time they ask for greater powers, we should give it willingly. That's one perspective on policing, certainly the dominant one when it comes to politicians both sides of the Atlantic like Donald Trump and Boris Johnson. But tonight I'm joined by Alex Vitale, author of The End of Policing, who thinks there's a decidedly different argument to be made. He thinks the police should be doing less, not more, that they need far fewer resources, and that the present system, especially in the United States, is better designed to create crime and a perpetual class of people labelled criminals than to stop it. But maybe that's the point. After all, perhaps it's better to see contemporary policing as something which aims purely at social control amid immense and rising inequality, rather than anything which concretely aims at justice. Alex, welcome to Novara Media.
Thank you, Aaron. I think we could just end it there. That's pretty much summed it up.
Before we get into the sort of meat of the book, and it's a fantastic book, and it's got a great new cover for people that want to buy it, which I would recommend. I always recommend sort of authors who are writing on social justice, who are doing a great job making a political intervention, support them, support their work. You can see that on the Verso Instagram, Twitter account, and so on. It's a great looking new book. They can buy it on Verso too. Before we get into the meat, were you expecting this kind of outpouring of resistance? We knew there'd be another Michael Brown, another Eric Garner, another sort of, Trayvon Martin. It's happened with George Floyd. But what's different this time? Why is it that much more antagonistic towards the state, towards the police?
Well, I didn't really expect it, though I have to say there were little hints. The way the police were enforcing the COVID crackdown was generating a lot of videos in which you could see people resisting the police, crowds resisting the police. And to me, that was like a red flag that something is going on, but I still didn't expect what we have in front of us today. As to why it's happening, I mean, I think there's the deep economic insecurity and uncertainty of this moment. But in terms of policing, I think part of it is that, 5 years ago, after the police murder of Eric Garner and Tamir Rice and Mike Brown and so many others, we were sold this idea, don't worry, we're going to fix it. The politicians, the police leaders, the Obama administration, the Department of Justice said, a bunch of academics and foundations said, don't worry, we've got a plan. It's called procedural justice. We're going to make the police fairer and nicer and more transparent, and this will fix the problem. Well, it's been 5 years. They've implemented all these fixes and nothing has changed. And I think that people have realized that these superficial solutions, they see through them, they're not working, and they're just outraged by the lack of change.
So the beginning of the book offers kind of like a genealogy, a history of the police. Can we just go into that? Where do the police come from? What's the sort of historical moment within which they emerge? What are they a response to?
It's all England's fault. Now, there's a kind of liberal narrative about the origins of policing that always begins with the London Metropolitan Police in 1829. They're routinely pointed to as the sort of first example of a modern police force, which is less than 200 years ago. This is a fairly modern institution. But what's left out of that narrative, that standard liberal narrative that you see in the policing textbooks, et cetera, is where this idea came from. So the London police are created by Sir Robert Peel, Bob, the Bobbies, and he got this idea in his previous job, which was that he was in charge of the English occupation of Ireland. And he develops the Irish Peace Preservation Force to help manage a growing number of what they called, agricultural outrages, which were really peasant uprising against landlords. And he could not rely on the military to bail him out because they were tied up with Napoleon and the treasury was empty. And so he comes across this idea of a cheaper, more nimble, community embedded sort of hybrid force that would allow them to act more preemptively, to kind of quell things before they got out of hand, and also to deal with things in a way that preserves some legitimacy for the occupation. that the use of the military often involves shooting on crowds, killing people that further undermine the legitimacy. And if policing could come in and calm things out with less violence, that would be good for the regime. He takes that idea to England to manage this massive influx of folks coming from the countryside who've been displaced by the enclosures, who are drawn by the new industrial economy. And policing is needed to craft that population into a stable working class, to put down the bread riots and the strikes and the just crime and widespread disorder. So it's about manufacturing a new working class. In the US, there are additional factors at work here. We have our own colonial origins of policing in the US tied to, the American occupation of the Philippines at the end of the Spanish-American Civil War, the Texas Rangers and other Western police forces that are created to drive out the indigenous population to make way for white settlement. But we also have the role of policing in maintaining and managing slavery. And I talk in the book about the case of Charleston, South Carolina. In the cities of the South, slaves lived and worked outside the home of their owners in wharves and workshops and warehouses. And policing emerges to manage that mobile slave population. In fact, the Charleston City Guard and Watch is formed well before the London Metropolitan Police, but it's never talked about in these liberal narratives because their primary law enforcement mission was suppressing the slave population.
Yeah, something I've noticed. I mean, I haven't written this in the script, but it's something I've noticed a lot actually. Is, for instance, when people talk about neoliberalism, there's this story about neoliberalism through Europe, through Hayek, the Austrian school. There's this other school of James Buchanan and the end of sort of desegregation. And it seems to me, as you've just very lucidly highlighted, this counter narrative of where policing comes from, deeply imbricated within the history of slavery in the American South. There's a really nice way you put it, which is that the American police, which if this kind of speculation of yours is correct, it's actually more of the sort of protean police force than what we have with the Metropolitan Police Service or the Bow Street Runners, their forerunner. It's this amalgam of northern technocracy and sort of southern oversight of slaves. So what precisely was bad about the northern bit? Because obviously in the sort of cliched understanding of the American North, the American South, we know why the sort of, the relationships of domination and oppression are bad with the South. What was the bad sort of features of northern policing?
Well, let's keep in mind that even the precursors in London were also about this beginning process of forming a capitalist working class. The Thames Wharf Police were created to eliminate the historical practice of gleaning, where workers took the spillage and the overage home as part of their wages. And capitalism can't abide that. So they create this protean police force to try to put a stop to that and to create a solely wage economy. And we see similar things happening in the northern United States, where policing emerges to bring this massive immigrant population that's flooding into the United States and form them into an industrial working class. They were regulating how people wore their clothing, all kinds of regulations about alcohol consumption, about public interactions that really had nothing to do with public safety issues or the law. It was about stamping people into this new working class. And then I'll just give this example. The first state police force in the United States was the Pennsylvania State Police, created in 1903. They were created because of the widespread strike and labor actions that were happening in the Pennsylvania coal and iron fields. And local police were unable or unwilling to suppress those labor movements. And so they created a state police force modeled on the US occupation forces in the Philippines to put down those strikes. Strikers at the time referred to them as the Pennsylvania Cossacks. And so northern policing has always been about a kind of racialized understanding of immigration, the management of those blacks who are in the city, and the suppression of workers' movements and really working class lifestyles.
And how does that change after the Civil Rights Act? Because obviously you have a massive flood of the black working class over the post-war period, basically going from the south to the north. How does that change, and how does it intersect with the rise of social movements and so on? How does American policing transform, particularly in the 1960s?
So policing, and it begins actually much earlier than that, because the Great Migration of the 19 teens and 20s is really when the initial ghettos of the American North get formed in clear parameters, and policing plays a central role in maintaining those physical and social boundaries. So the new Jim Crow in the North is about the creation of these isolated communities, which is different than in the South, where blacks and whites often lived close together in often a servant master kind of relationship, even in the paid economy. In the North, blacks are shunted out of view in the worst housing, close to sanitation, slaughterhouses, things like that. And police ensure that they don't try to move outside of those boundaries. And then they channel in things like vice and prostitution. So they say, well, it's a free fire zone in those communities. We're not really going to do anything to protect them as long as it stays in there.
So let's move on to what you call the liberal view in the book, about basically the police are here to protect us from the bad guys. Now, a lot of our audience will understand, or they'll think that's not correct. But for people who are watching and think, yeah, the police are here to protect us from the bad guys, why is that not an accurate account of the police in the 21st century? And why shouldn't we think about the police like that?
You know, there's a part of this story that's like 200 years old, and then there's a part of the story that's about the last 40 years. So there's this baseline in which policing is always about constructing criminality as an explanation for working class lifestyles, resistance to exploitation, etc. What we've seen in the last 40 years is just this radical expansion of this idea into an increasing number of realms of everyday life for especially poor and non-white folks. So we've interjected policing into our schools to manage homelessness, to manage untreated mental health, to deal with substance abuse issues in ways that would have seemed quite alien to police of 50, 60 years ago, and seems today quite alien to police, for instance, in Europe.
I've just lost this, so I've lost my train of thought. We're going to go to Minneapolis now. We've obviously been talking about the sort of general context. Obviously, with the protests in response to George Floyd's death, there'll be a number of proposals as to how the police can improve, particularly in Minneapolis. What's interesting, actually, is in the book you detail several examples of the kinds of reforms you hinted at it at the beginning of the interview, the sort of procedural justice stuff. Some reforms about how these kinds of atrocities could be avoided in the future. Of course, that hasn't happened. It's happened again. Can you just quickly list the kinds of reforms, the kinds of pilots which have been trialed in places like Minneapolis over the last 5, 10, 15 years?
Yeah, so Minneapolis was really held out as a kind of shining star because of its embracing of all these procedural justice reforms that the Obama administration and others were putting forward. They had, implicit bias training. They had mindfulness training. They had community police encounter sessions. They implemented body cameras. They tried to diversify the race of the police department. They created early warning systems to identify problem officers and to correct their behavior. And none of this stuff helps. It's been completely ineffective, and I think that is a big part of both the anger by the protesters and the violence by the police, in part because I think the police have run out of excuses, and they're down to just doubling down on violence and authoritarianism. They've run out of liberal excuses for what they do.
So you don't think more training will work? You make a really interesting point, which is that actually more, I mean, we're hearing this already, but more black officers won't work. I mean, that's a really off the kind of shelf response. We had it a lot in this country after the 2011 London riots. Oh, these are white officers coming from outside of London. policing a primarily sort of BAME metropolis. I mean, you actually highlight some studies which suggest that actually black officers are more likely to behave in a untoward manner towards black people than white officers. Can you talk about why more black police officers isn't the solution, in your opinion?
Yeah, so most of this research is US based, so I don't know exactly what's been done in the UK, but the results are really unambiguous. I mean, every single time we look at this, we find that the race of officers is not a significant effect on the way policing is done. You can understand why people would want to make these demands. The belief that if there were more people from their community, that this would impact the way that policing is carried out. And it just turns out that it's not true. The institutional imperatives that shape the job just turn out to be so much more important than the attitude of officers. And we can all point to that one special officer who's very good at communicating to people and diffusing a situation. But even for that officer, when push comes to shove, right, they are a police officer. They are a violence worker. And when the boss says, go out and make arrests or suppress that protest, they will do so. And their personal opinion about it is essentially irrelevant. I mean, I find the research surprising. I would have thought it would have made some difference, but study after study after study shows that it makes no difference. And maybe it's important as an employment program to diversify who gets those good jobs, but it doesn't. It's not going to make policing better.
Another one of the sort of shibboleths you talk about in the book is the broken windows theory, what might be called sort of Brattonism, named after Bill Bratton. He's been everywhere, I think. NYPD, has he been to LA?
Oh yes, he was in charge of the LAPD for many years.
Yeah, so he kind of the godfather of this theory, which is, well, it doesn't come from him, but the idea that there was this social study. We talked about it actually with Rutger Bregman last week. If a car is left in a neighborhood and it's fine, nothing happens to it. If a car is left in a neighborhood with a single broken window, before you know it, it becomes the epicenter of violence and criminality and so on. And in the book, you say that that's just evidently failed. It's underpinned racist policing practices, the sort of broken windows theory. We adopted it here wholesale as well. I guess the counter argument is, and you do talk about this, in big cities, New York, for instance, has levels of homicide which are at historic lows. We've seen crime fall in major cities across the United States, but also here in Britain too, actually, for decades. And the background to that was zero tolerance approaches to policing. Now, I would never endorse those, but how do you respond to the argument? Well, look, they're doing what they claim they do. They sort of do the job.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. So let's just start with the crime decline numbers. So the crime decline is in fact an international phenomenon. It's happening in a lot of places, including a lot of places that never use broken windows policing. In the United States, we have about 18 to 20,000 independent local police departments. And there's no national policy, no national standards. And when we look at things like when did a department implement broken windows policing versus other departments, we find no effect. That the broken windows theory, it got so much currency for two reasons. One is that it was in New York, where the media are, and it corresponded with this crime decline. And the other is that it provided this powerful political narrative to justify austerity politics. The genius of it, right, and it's linked to these very conservative intellectuals, part of the kind of neoconservative turn in American politics, who managed to switch the idea that poverty causes crime to the idea that crime causes poverty. That when we leave disorder unchecked, it automatically leads to serious crime. And of course, it was often used to do things like go after homeless people, panhandling, as if they were somehow going to turn into murderers if we didn't arrest them for panhandling. There's never been any empirical research to justify this. The original article was in the Atlantic magazine. It was not in a peer-reviewed journal. It was a political intervention that got picked up by politicians because it justified their turn away from social services and towards criminalization. And I think that's really what's driving this. And you asked before about, don't police go after the bad guys? But what they've done is they've defined the bad guys as those people who are a source of disorder and discomfort precisely because they're on the losing end of these new economic relationships. And it's essential to them to define homelessness and youth crime and mental health problems as problems of individual and group moral failure that will only respond to punitive policing. Because the alternative would be to acknowledge that these are market failures. These are failures of labor markets, of housing markets, of healthcare markets, which unfortunately we have in the US, right? And that if we acknowledge that, then they'd have to do something about those markets. But that's precisely what they don't want to do. They want to preserve this neoliberal ideology that keeps pumping resources up the economic ladder.
And there's maybe you can go into some of the individuals involved in this, but there is quite an intimate relationship between that explicitly neoliberal thought architecture, stuff like the bell curve, and then the broken windows stuff. Can you go into some of the personalities that quote unquote thinkers involved in this stuff and their proximity to right-wing politics?
Yeah, well, the root of this in some ways is Edward Banfield, who in the early 60s, after serving in Vietnam as an advisor in Vietnam as part of the architecture of counterinsurgency in Vietnam, he comes back to the United States and sees poor people in the United States as if they're the VC, in a sense. He's like, these folks are a threat to the order, and he treats them like they're children. Right? The racism inherent in the US project in Vietnam, that these people are incapable of making their own decisions. So he writes about how the poor aren't interested in bettering their lives. If you try to give them something positive, they'll just damage it. They'll open a new library, they'll just vandalize it. We don't need to waste our time trying to help these people. We need to give them authoritarian interventions to force them to be productive citizens according to our idea of what's good and just and productive. So Banfield kind of writes these books making these essentially deeply racist arguments. And there's a whole community at the University of Chicago, neoliberal economists like Milton Friedman, sociologists like James Q. Wilson, and they are all trying to connect the dots between disinvestment, austerity, and criminalization. And really the broken windows theory is this linchpin of connecting neoliberalism and neoconservatism. So David Harvey, for instance, talks about how neoliberalism is the economic ideology of heightened class power for the rich, and it generates these consequences that get responded to through neoconservatism, both at home and internationally. So it's about warmongering internationally, counterinsurgency internationally, and it's about criminalization and mass incarceration domestically.
That's such a fantastic way of putting it. I'd never heard that, but it's a beautiful frame. We've got 1,650 people watching. We're not quite there. Tysky Sour is our flagship show. Does very well. We've only just started doing these one-on-one interviews. But if you like what you're watching, please share this interview. We're not quite sure on the hashtag yet. Should it be hashtag TBF or hashtag the Bastani factor? I do aim at being relatively humble. I think TBF is a much shorter hashtag. However, it's probably used very frequently elsewhere. Maybe put your comments in the comment section beside this. Also, we may take some questions at the end. If you have any questions, put them in there with the rocket emoji. And if you really like what we're doing, smash the like button. Let's get more than 1,000 likes for this show. Really appreciate it. Fantastic guest. And before we started, actually, Alex, we were talking about how many downloads the ebook, which is free on the Verso website, has got just in the last couple of days. Can you just tell our audience how well that's doing?
Yeah, they told me yesterday that it was over 15,000, and that was in the morning. That did not include, the last 24 hours.
I mean, that's remarkable.
Yeah.
could end up
And
being
I
sort of.
think you said it was sold out on some Amazon
Yeah,
platforms. And
what was interesting for me was in the UK, so not even in the US, your
right.
book and the new Jim Crow were both sold out on Amazon. I'm thinking, well, something strange is going on if they're both sold out in the UK. I mean, it shows the sort of, the internationalization of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah, when I checked the other day, it was like number 1,500 of all books on Amazon.
It's probably gone up significantly.
Yeah.
We were saying, I hope you go on somewhere like Joe Rogan or it does speak to the, it is strange because 3 or 4 years ago, the idea of an American president sort of doxing an activist and saying these are anarchists, obviously that would have been implausible. Equally, a sort of academic talking about how can we reduce the scope and the competences of the police. The idea that you would be going into the mainstream media, whether it's CNN or whoever you might be talking to in the next few days, and it's happening. I mean, did you think there would be this kind of attention to your area of policy expertise? Did you think that would happen, or?
Certainly not when I made the deal with Verso. I mean, that I had the deal with Verso before Ferguson happened or before
Wow.
Eric Garner was killed. They wanted me to write a book about the NYPD, and I said, I don't really want to do that, but I got this other crazy idea. There's all this talk about prison abolition, but no one's really thought through in print, I think, what that would mean for policing. I mean,
Yeah.
there were some precursors. Christian Williams' book, Our Enemies in Blue, certainly tracked some of that territory. But, I thought there was room for not just a criticism of policing, but laying out a program about how to move forward, which the book spends a lot of time trying to do. That really hadn't been done. And so immediately the book was much more popular than anyone imagined, even when it first came out. And then the current explosion, well, who knows how long it'll last or what the impact will be. My main goal is to try to move the needle for liberals who know there's a problem with policing, but think it can be fixed with a police community meeting or body cameras, to get them to have a deeper analysis. That's always been the strategic objective. I'm not trying to convince the police of anything. I'm not trying to convince the thin blue line folks of anything. I'm trying to move the needle on our movements. And along with a whole crew of other people doing this work, this is really happening in the US. The needle is moving, and we see that in the streets. The signs say defund the police.
Yeah.
And that is exactly what we need to do.
Yeah, I mean, we have our problems here in the UK, but reading the book really brought home and I think it's really important to not minimise the racism which is endemic to Britain, its colonial history, policing practices, and so on. 1,500 people have died in police custody since 1990. But the scale of what the police kind of apparatus in America is it's immense and it's frightening. Which brings me to my next question, which is, Alex, why are there police, or why are there so many police in America's schools? Because that is something which is utterly incomprehensible to a British audience. The idea of sort of almost quotidian, mundane feature of school life being the police. Why are they there? When did this start happening?
In New York City, we have 5,000 NYPD personnel stationed in city schools. That's more than all counselors of all varieties combined. It is just the most colossal injustice. School policing was, starts in little fits and starts in the 50s as an effort to deal with, youth gangs and stuff. And actually they put them in elementary schools because had nothing to do with keeping kids safe. It was about teaching them respect for authority, to get them to, get close to police so that hopefully when they grew up, they would be better behaved. But the real explosion happens in the 1990s, and there are really a few factors involved there. One was the emergence of the school reform movement in the US, which was part of austerity politics. Politicians like George W. Bush, when he was governor of Texas, he begins, this move towards rigorous standardized testing on a small number of subjects as the only real measure of educational success, tearing out everything else, high stakes testing, and then a whole set of zero tolerance disciplinary procedures that turn out to be designed primarily to drive out those kids who are not performing. And they put them in these alternative high schools that really look like jails, and then they exempt them from participating in the testing. So then the testing looks great, and Bush says it's the Texas miracle, we fixed education, by criminalizing tens of thousands of school children. This gives rise to school policing across the country, which is subsidized by the Clinton administration in the '94 crime bill, where he gives them money to hire school police. The second factor was the Columbine shooting in Colorado that happens in the '90s. And the thing is that created a kind of panic about school safety that the school policing folks, drove right into. But the reality was there were armed police at Columbine that day. It made no difference. There were armed police, in Parkland, Florida. It didn't matter. Armed policing is not working in preventing these school shootings. The third factor that was driving all this was the super predator myth, which goes back to the same collection of neoconservative intellectuals, in this case, John DiIulio at Princeton at the time, who says we're getting ready to have this wave of sociopathic youth violence based on a lot of spurious demographic data that turned out to be totally false, and a misrepresentation of some research in Philadelphia. And every year since the super predator myth came out, youth violence has fallen. Youth crime has fallen. But the politicians picked up this hysteria about super predators to create more school policing, to lower the age of criminal responsibility, to increase zero tolerance policing, et cetera. So all three of these things come together to create a kind of perfect storm that generates the creation of thousands of new school police departments, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of new school policing officers. And that legacy is still with us today.
We've had a few people in the comments talk about drugs, the war on drugs. Gary, if we can actually just get up graphic 1, this is just such a great place to start. And you cite this quote in the book. It's from John Ehrlichman, and this is to Dan Baum. I've not read the book itself, but I've now got it on my wish list. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and the black people, or black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal. By the way, this gentleman was an advisor to President Nixon. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. I think there's another quote. Is there, Gary? Or is that? Yeah, there we go. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes. Of course, that happened, for instance, in the instance of Fred Hampton, the Black Panther Party, break up their meetings and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. I mean, that's just an amazing passage. And he relays that in the mid-1990s?
Yes, and he was a senior advisor to Nixon. This was not some intern in a corner. Yeah, he was at the meetings where these decisions were being made.
I mean, it sounds like sort of a conspiratorial analysis you would hear from the sort of, again, not even conspiratorial, something Huey P. Newton might say, but actually coming from the mouth of a Nixon advisor, and it's kind of just saying, yeah, this nexus of activists and people seeking racial equality. Well, yeah, of course we hit them with the war on drugs. Can you talk about that a bit more?
Well, Newton had a pretty good analysis about the intersection of colonialism and American racism. He wasn't all conspiracy theories. And I do want to recommend Dan Baum's book, which I used to teach, and maybe also Chasing the Screen, which is a good history of the American drug war. So it's not only about attacking their political enemies, it was also a central part of what's been called the Southern strategy.
Yeah.
This was the decision by the Republicans to try to win over historically Democratic white voters in the South and in the suburban US over to the Republican Party in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement. And they attempt to do this by bringing the federal government into the law and order debate. Now, historically, the federal law enforcement's role was quite minimal. criminal statutes in the United States are almost all state statutes enforced by local police and state courts. Nixon said, well, we can claim to be law and order by using drugs because drugs cross state lines often. Sometimes they're imported across the border. Therefore, that's our way to get in as the federal government. And he says, we're going to use that to demonize African Americans rhetorically, but also physically to criminalize them. And by doing so, we'll signal to white voters that we're going to be the new home of racial animus. We can't bring back segregation and Jim Crow. We lost that battle. But what we're going to do instead is we're going to have this war on crime, war on drugs that's going to demonize and criminalize Black America. It was the solution to a political problem. It had nothing to do with public health or public safety. It practically had nothing to do with drugs. Nixon's own health advisors were for legalization and harm reduction strategies. And it just was irrelevant. They're like, this is a political fix that we need, and we're going to just throw police at it. And this is true of so many things that police do. It's about a set of political imperatives that policing are being pressed into the service to make happen.
And this relationship between drugs and a sort of racialized subaltern, I mean, you talk about it as well with opium and sort of Chinese immigrants earlier on in the century. So this is something we see repeatedly, isn't it? You see it with marijuana and Mexicans, with heroin and African American communities, and with opium with Chinese communities. Can you talk about sort of brief history then of how this works? Because of course you talk about in the book how amphetamines weren't just legal but widely used by Americans of all colors and creeds for a very, very long time. So what changes and what's the sort of sequence of events here in the relationship between narcotics and policing? And of course you've got alcohol in there as well. Which was criminalized about 15 years. Between about 1900 and the 1960s, what's going on in this ebb and flow of criminalization and illicit substances?
I mean, the thing to keep in mind here is that Americans love drugs of all kinds and stimulants and whatever, and they will use them in different forms. And so what distinguishes those that are criminalized and those that aren't is often a question of race, starting with the criminalization of the Chinese population. I think I've lost you here.
I can see you.
You can see me and you can hear me?
I can hear you fine. Don't
okay,
worry.
I'm sorry. My screen has completely frozen. I
That's
will
fine.
Continue then. Okay, sorry. So it starts with the criminalization of Chinese populations on the West Coast who are importing opium from China. And it's when white women get involved in the consumption of opium that it becomes a public scandal. And there's an immediate criminalization of that Chinese population for endangering the welfare of these upper class white women who are going to smoke opium during the day to overcome the boredom of their second class status in American society. In the South, marijuana criminalization is used to manage the Latino population that moves back and forth across the Mexican border, and also jazz musicians in the North who get turned on to marijuana and it becomes a widespread practice. So alcohol was legal and then becomes illegal when it becomes associated with these new Southern European immigrants that are flooding into the country 100 years ago. And native white Protestants are looking to how to neutralize both the political power and the social impact and cultural impact of this new population. They resent these new democratic immigrant cities, and they see the beer halls as a center of political organizing. They cannot stand their Catholicism and their different lifestyles, and they say the solution to this is to restrict alcohol consumption. So they try that It's a total failure. We're now trying it with all these other narcotics. It's a total failure. But the politicians cling to it because it still serves a political function. They still believe that they can get elected to office through this process of criminalizing the most suspect populations.
Yeah, I knew that Ray Charles was arrested on, I think, possession, taking, I think it was heroin, wasn't it? But
Yes.
I didn't realize that Billie Holiday actually died in police custody.
That's correct. Harry Anslinger, who's like the federal drug czar, personally made it his mission to drive her into the criminal justice system, and I hold him directly responsible for her death. He made it so that she was so medically compromised that she finally died.
Crazy story. I had no idea. It's easy to paint Nixon as the bad guy. I think he was the most terrible sort of American sort of president of the last sort of in living memory. But I want to talk briefly about Bill Clinton, because obviously, you know, this becomes a partisan debate, especially in an election year. People say, well, if you want to change things, you've got to vote for a Democrat. In this instance, it's Joe Biden. Maybe we'll have an opportunity to talk about him a bit later on. But Bill Clinton and his kind of his 2 terms as president, he was a particularly bad president when it came to incarceration rates, particularly among African Americans, when it came to criminalization around drugs and so on. Can you just talk about the sort of war on drugs and racist policing practices, particularly as it pertains under Bill Clinton, and particularly in reference to the 1994 crime bill?
So, you know, Nixon shows that this criminalization strategy, this Southern strategy, can work. And it was a real threat to the Democratic Party. The Democrats try to respond by running a bunch of Southerners for president, Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton. And Clinton realized, and Carter doesn't last very long, and Clinton realizes for a Democrat to get elected, he has to be able to appeal to these racist sentiments through this coded drug war language. And that's exactly what he does. He's governor of Arkansas. He even, in the middle of the campaign, goes back to Arkansas to personally supervise the execution of a person with an IQ of about 60.
Wow. Who
was clearly mentally disabled, to make it clear that he was not going to be outdone by the Republicans on the politics of vengeance and criminalization. And in 1994, he unleashes the 94 crime bill, which dramatically expands death penalty offenses, puts billions and billions of dollars in the budget to subsidize the hiring of more police, the building of new prisons, and it includes language that requires that states up the penalties for all kinds of offenses, including drug offenses. So Clinton is a major architect of mass incarceration. He's fully implicated in that project, along with local district attorneys and state legislatures. It was a bipartisan project of taking the most vulnerable populations and criminalizing them.
Was there ever a sort of plausible alternative within the Democratic Party on this stuff? Was there ever another pole of attraction? So, for instance, in Britain, in the 1980s, you have Tony Benn, sort of London politicians, people like Ken Livingstone, offering a sort of different pole of attraction. But by the mid-1990s, just like the New Democrats in the United States, it's clear that if Labour, for the right of the party, if they want to govern again, they're going to have to basically, like you say, implicate themselves in the big sort of answers of the neoliberal era, in this case, criminal justice. But was there ever a sort of competing strand within the Democratic Party, or did this have complete buy-in from across the Democratic Party? This is just something we've got to do. Was there ever a debate here?
Absolutely. I mean, the 1980s was the period of Jesse Jackson and the Rainbow Coalition leading up to Clinton. So there was a movement to create a multiracial working class movement to try to take over the Democratic Party. And the Democratic establishment, just like their orientation to Bernie Sanders, did everything they could to sabotage that movement. clearing the way for a conservative Southern strategy. So yes, there were alternatives out there, just as there are alternatives today. We could be looking to a kind of democratic socialist vision that speaks to the working class population, but instead the party has made its allegiance to the big donors, to the Wall Street types, who allow them to do the big ad buys and to maintain this kind of very hierarchically organized party.
Very quickly, I mean, I didn't really think we'd have time to talk about Joe Biden, but as we've said already, it's an election year. Joe Biden's day gave this big speech about, sort of structural racism endemic within America. And credit to him, he also did talk about how its base is economic inequality, which that did surprise me. But what's your kind of read on what's going on in the Democratic Party? And if Joe Biden was to become president, if they had over the next couple of years control of both houses, there's the possibility of actually changing something there. Which way do you think they would go?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not super optimistic about this. I mean, Obama said a lot of great things too. He struck this note that gave people a sense of possibility, and then he did almost nothing about it, right? I mean, he did nothing to reduce inequality, nothing to really impact the African American community positively, certainly nothing to reduce mass incarceration. So yeah, flowery words and taking a knee, that's all very nice, but that's not real policy. Where is the talk about actually investing in strategies to deal with entrenched poverty? Biden hasn't said a word about mass homelessness, about untreated mental illness. He's telling us why we can't have universal health insurance. His strategies just totally fall flat, I think, for anyone who sees the level of poverty and social isolation in the United States.
You've probably shown your cards to our audience, but what do you think the United States should be doing differently? You've had this diagnosis of policing in America. It costs an immense amount of money. If you were the top advisor to a president of whatever party which decided to change things, they had all the political leverage necessary to do it. What's the path you would advise in terms of pursuing things?
Well, I did advise the Sanders campaign on their criminal justice policy. I helped, write language for them. So what I encouraged them to say was that justice is not achieved through punishment and incarceration. Safety is not just a question of punitiveness, that we need a positive message about making communities safer and healthier by actually addressing the problems in those communities in a way that makes them better, that tries to build people up instead of tearing them down, that tries to build social cohesion instead of tearing it apart. So instead of seeing every problem as something for the police to fix, we need to identify real ameliorative strategies that hopefully create some political space for us to do the longer term work of addressing these gross inequalities.
Why do you think it's so hard for politicians, particularly Democratic politicians, just to say that? I mean, it should be quite an easy sell, even to law enforcement themselves. Look, you're doing too much here. That we're putting you under real strains here. Emotional, financial. I mean, they've got far more resources than other parts of the American sort of state apparatus, but still they're being asked to do more and more all of the time, particularly in a context that we see at the moment, sort of civil unrest and so on. I mean, why is this such a hard sell? Why is no mainstream politician other than Bernie Sanders talking about this, really?
Yeah, I think there's been this bipartisan consensus around austerity, and I think part of it is the pressures of globalization, where people feel like they have no choice but to turn everything over to a handful of global players, that Amazon can kind of write its ticket in hopes that this will trickle down in some way, and just a deep pessimism about the ability of the state to actually redistribute resources and remain, relevant. It's a hard situation. I mean, the global pressures are real. No one wants to be Detroit, that's been economically abandoned. But I think states have got to use the limited resources they have to try to counteract the worst forms of these neoliberal systems rather than accelerating them. And then ultimately, we've got to try to figure out a different system. But it's my view that it's going to be really hard to figure out that different system if we don't address mass criminalization and an ever expanding carceral apparatus that in moments exactly like we're in now are going to be unleashed on our movements.
Let me rephrase this, because that's absolutely right. There's been this austerity logic since 2008. Every year, it's been a huge public debate in America about the federal sort of budget, and over here too, talking about the deficit. But as you detail in the book, it's so expensive to incarcerate so many people. It's so expensive to have such high levels of recidivism and reoffending. It's so expensive to be giving that military level hardware to police forces. I mean, surely there is a counter argument here. Surely sort of austerity could have been an impetus for the police to be doing less, like you say, defund the police. And I'm not suggesting that that's a particularly radical message within the context of austerity. That would just mean privatizing and outsourcing the police, as the Conservative Party have done here. But it does seem strange that something which would save the taxpayer so much money hasn't been pursued, in which case you think, well, this must tap into something deeper, a set of cultural values, a powerful lobby. I mean, can you just sort of touch upon that briefly?
Yeah, I think there are two ways to think about this. One is that it's essential that they preserve the neoliberal ideology, because the neoliberal ideology protects the most successful segments of the economy from being taxed and regulated. It gives them free rein to do what they want to do. And once we acknowledge that maybe the state could play a redistributive role, then they're going to be the first target of that. So they cannot abide that. And they have done a very good job of funding both political parties. The other thing is that ultimately, to solve the kinds of problems we need to solve, it's going to be more expensive than what we spend on police and prisons. The police and prisons do save them money. Actually building the amount of public housing that would be needed to house millions of Americans is going to be expensive. It's going to require not just dismantling prisons and policing, it's going to require dismantling militarization and all the economic interests that are embedded in that, and a significant redistribution of wealth. And that's really the battle that's in front of us. And unfortunately, there's really not too many players on the national stage in the US who are willing to talk about that.
So I guess that's a point of disagreement then between you and somebody like a Rutger Bregman. I've talked about his last book with him last week, Humankind. He did Utopia for Realists. I don't know if you saw Rupert Murdoch reading it. It was a big hit over here in Europe. He would say, well, look, if you look at Norway, their prisons mean such low rates of reoffending. I mean, John Edwards said it, I think, in 2008. It's cheaper to send a young man to Yale than to jail. What you're saying is actually that's not entirely accurate, because the prison industrial complex is overseeing such profound inequality that as a complex of social control, it is good value for the 1%. It is good value for the elite. So you think, is it fair to say you think that somebody like a Rutger Bregman is kind of misguided in his analysis in relationship to prison and the policing?
Yeah, I think it's a softer version of this, right? So it's trying to make the pocketbook argument. But Norway has a completely different approach towards taxation. They have much less overall inequality. They don't allow, this wage spread that we have in the US. They don't allow there to be all these billionaires. And so, yeah, in that context, it seems like, oh, this is more efficient and we can just save money. But I always say, it's not mass incarceration and mass criminalization. It's not about a few private prison contracts. It's not about $10 million in food commissaries here or there. It's about the raiding of trillions of dollars. That's what's at stake here. It's an ideology. It's a project that enables the looting of the entire economy. So there is a lot at stake here.
We'll take one question, I think. So we're going to wrap up hopefully after 9. You've said before we started, you're doing sort of 10 of these a day. So I'm really grateful for you coming on Novara Media. This is a quote from the book. Racial segregation in the United States is as bad today as it has ever been. I just want to ask you, I mean, is that true? And I mean, I do find it utterly remarkable that that could be articulated when you've just had the first African-American president. Do you still stand by that statement?
Yeah. So residential segregation remains just as polarized as it's ever been. It's gotten worse in recent decades. School segregation, much worse than it was in the 70s and 80s. We still do not have, blacks still have very limited access to all kinds of employment sectors. So yes, we remain a deeply segregated society. It's belied by a lot of symbolism. A black president, blacks on television, black celebrities, sports stars, but these are the exceptions. Standards of living for African Americans has been declining relative to whites in recent years. So yes, racial justice remains a core problem in the United States.
This is a really great question. This is just because it's obviously relating to the ongoing protests, and it speaks to an escalation which isn't touched upon in the book. This is from Andco. So now the military are getting involved. Is that the end of these protests? And will the media try and sweep this under the carpet in the next few weeks? Yeah, the introduction of the media, is that something you would have anticipated? And what does it tell us about the scale of the crisis? And what's the legality here? Because, you know, it's easy for us to get in Britain. We don't have a constitution. You guys do. What does it mean to have, the military on the streets policing protest?
Well, obviously, this is tied to Trump's overall political strategy. He thinks that if he doubles down on authoritarianism, that will rally his base. My concern is that the liberal media here in the United States will accept the validity of that out of fear and will attempt to suppress the demonstrations rhetorically in terms of news coverage because they think that, frankly, that white Americans will turn to Trump out of fear of Black America. So there is a real chance that there will be a suppression of coverage of these demonstrations going forward, I think.
And the involvement of the military, I mean, has that got any? Obviously, there have been involved, National Guard and so on, but at scale in multiple states simultaneously, is there any sort of precedent for what may be about to happen with the involvement of the army in modern times?
Not really. I mean, we've only had isolated incidents like, the Detroit riots, the Rodney King riots. I think the closest was the wave of outbreaks after the assassination of Martin Luther King. But that all happened very quickly and dissipated. This has been going on for a week now. And so the scale of it is quite significant, and the fact that we might see tanks rolling onto American streets, I think, should be horrifying to the American public. But my fear is that it will only, embolden authoritarian sentiment.
And then finally, we'll let you go. But what books would you recommend to our audience in terms of getting a better grasp on American policing, the carceral system, and so on?
Well, there's a nice book about policing Los Angeles that shows, how pointless a lot of these reforms are, especially community policing, and looks at the history of community organizing in Los Angeles. I found a new book called Decriminalizing Domestic Violence, very compelling and in a very challenging area for a lot of people. And I'm a huge fan of Revolting Prostitutes, another Verso Press book by two English authors, both sex workers who speak about sex work from a labor perspective, which I really appreciated. So that there's some quick reading suggestions for you.
Excellent, Alex. Well, you weren't so sure we'd fit it all in 1 hour. We didn't answer all the questions. We gave it a good go. Thanks very much for joining us. You've been watching Novara Media. My name's Aaron Bastani. We've got Michael Walker back tomorrow evening with Tiski Sa. If you like what you've been watching, please go to novaramedia.com/support. Alex, thanks again.
You bet, Aaron.
And stay safe with everything going forward. Michael will see you. Michael will see you tomorrow evening. And don't forget to download Alex's book. It's fantastic. It's on the Verso website. Good night.